You know, some years just kind of come and go, but others, they change everything. And 1945, well, that was one of those years. It was a year of fire, of absolute endings, and of brand new beginnings that literally forged the foundation of the world we live in right now. So let's dive into how this single incredible year redrew the map of human history. And look, that is no exaggeration. This one chaotic 12-month period marked a violent, definitive turning point for all of us. It was the end of one kind of nightmare, and in a lot of ways, the beginning of a whole new one. So, picture this. It's the dawn of 1945, and the entire world is just completely and utterly exhausted. Years of total war had taken a brutal toll, and yet the fighting was somehow at its most vicious. Europe was ablaze, and millions of soldiers were huddled in frozen trenches, all wondering the same thing. When is this ever going to end? Over on the Western Front, Hitler made this final desperate gamble, launching a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. Now, it did catch the Allies off guard, but they reacted with incredible speed. At the very same time, though, a much bigger storm was gathering in the east. The Soviet Red Army was preparing a massive steamroller of an offensive that was about to change the map of Europe forever. I mean, the sheer scale of the Soviet force was just staggering. The Red Army had 6.7 million troops positioned between the Baltic and the Adriatic Seas. That's more than double the German forces on that entire front. Nazi Germany was caught in a vice, and it was about to be squeezed completely shut. The first half of 1945, really, it's all about collapse. The Axis powers, who had seemed totally invincible just a few years before, were now just crumbling. And this led to some of the most climactic and frankly horrifying moments of the entire war. As the Red Army pushed its way west, they stumbled upon something that was truly beyond comprehension. On January 27th, Soviet soldiers walked into a place called Auschwitz, and the rest of the world was about to uncover a level of horror that words could never, ever truly capture. You know, there's a huge difference between hearing about something and actually seeing it with your own eyes. Sure, rumors and whispers about the camps had been circulating, but it was all abstract. It wasn't until the newsreels and the photographs started to come out, those images of skeletal survivors and just unimaginable horror, that the world was forced to confront the reality. The true industrial scale of the Nazi genocide shocked humanity to its very core. All right, so the final act in Europe? The battle for Berlin. General Eisenhower made the controversial call to halt the Western Allies, letting the Soviets be the ones to take the city. What happened next was a meat grinder, just vicious block-by-block fighting. And deep below the city, in his bunker, a totally delusional Hitler moved imaginary armies on a map before finally taking his own life. The war in Europe ended with a Soviet flag flying over the ruins of the Reichstag. But here's the thing. Victory in Europe didn't mean peace, not even close. Half a world away, an entirely different kind of war was still raging. This wasn't a war of tanks rolling across huge open plains. This was a brutal, dehumanizing slog from one volcanic island to the next, against an enemy who was indoctrinated to never, ever surrender. And this sheer desperation led Japan to unleash something just terrifying, the kamikaze. They take pilots with barely any training, pack their planes full of explosives, and send them on one-way missions to fly directly into American warships. It was a horrifyingly effective strategy designed to inflict the most pain and the most casualties possible. So this fanaticism from the Japanese defense created this awful problem for the Allies. And the solution they turned to? Well, it wouldn't just end the war. It would change the very nature of human conflict. Forever. This was the crucial point, the question facing all the Allied leaders. How do you end a war against an enemy that just will not give up? Planners estimated that a full-scale invasion of Japan's home islands could cost 500,000 Allied casualties and millions of Japanese lives. It was an almost impossible strategic and moral dilemma. How do you stop the killing without causing even more imaginable bloodshed? And then, the answer to that impossible question arrived. It came from the sky. A single plane, the Enola Gay, flew high over Japan, and it was carrying a weapon that held the power to end the war in a single, terrifying flash. Over the city of Hiroshima, it released one bomb. And in a single, blinding flash, the city was just gone. The nuclear age had begun, and humanity now possessed the power to wipe itself off the face of the earth. 70,000 people. Just think about that for a second. 70,000 lives extinguished in an instant. And that was just the beginning. Tens of thousands more would die in the days, weeks, and years that followed from their wounds and from radiation sickness. After a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki just 3 days later, the Japanese emperor finally stepped in and ordered a surrender. On September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the most destructive war in human history officially came to an end. An incredible sense of relief swept across the globe, but right underneath it, a new and terrible fear had been born. But here's the twist. The end of that hot war immediately gave rise to a new kind of conflict. With their common enemy finally defeated, the victorious allies now had to figure out what the future was going to look like. The problem was, their visions for that future were completely incompatible. At conferences like Potsdam, you could feel the clash immediately. On one hand, you had the United States envisioning a new world of free elections and international cooperation. But then you had Stalin and the Soviet Union, who, having been invaded twice, were absolutely determined to create a buffer zone of communist states in Eastern Europe to protect their borders. The seeds of the Cold War were sown right there in the ashes of World War II. But, it wasn't all just new conflict. In the middle of all this rising tension, there were these genuine, incredible efforts to build a better world. Two major institutions were born in 1945 that aimed to stop a catastrophe like this from ever happening again. The United Nations, created to foster diplomacy, and the Nuremberg trials, designed to set a new standard for international justice. And out of Nuremberg came this absolutely game-changing legal idea: crimes against humanity. For the first time ever, international law said that some acts are so awful, they're an offense against all of humankind. This was huge. It basically meant that the excuse, "Hey, I was just following orders," was no longer going to fly when it came to committing these kinds of atrocities. So when you step back and look at it, 1945 gave us the atomic age, the United Nations, the Cold War, and this idea of crimes against humanity. It literally forged the institutions and the tensions that have defined our world for nearly 80 years. And that leaves us with one really big question for today. The world order that was built back in 1945, how much longer can it actually last?